to allow you to review that and get the quiz out of the way before new material gets added on top of it. But because most of our veins travel with arteries, I thought it would be a more efficient use of our lab time that you were looking at those at the same time. You're going to be looking at the arteries, you might as well see the veins beside them. So I won't do the entire lecture. I'll break it up a couple of times, but we'll have lab and the quiz towards the end of lab rather than at the beginning of lab time. All right? So I'm going to be drawing in blue. I probably should be drawing in purple because our venous blood is not completely unoxygenated, it's deoxygenated. And I'm going to be, remember how I drew away from the heart on Friday and Thursday and Friday, because blood is in the arteries is flowing away from the heart. So this time I'm going to emphasize the return to the heart. All right, so blood is returning to the heart. And hopefully we'll have some time to do some blood tracing pathways as well to get you guys used to that. So we're going to start off with the return of the blood from the head and neck region. And so we'll start with the brain. And how many of you did dural sinuses in Bio 430? I know some of you did do the arteries. Anybody do the dural sinuses, superior sagittal sinus, and so on?
I did.
Can we do that? All right. Well, let me just show you structurally what we're talking about first then. I know you know what the dura mater is. And so this is showing the false cerebri between the hemispheres. So this would be in the longitudinal fissure, the tentorium cerebelli, and very difficult to see in actual life, the false cerebelli. At the top, just under the skull, the dura mater splits and creates a space, a cavity, known as a sinus. It's not an actual blood vessel. It's not lined with simple squamous epithelia. It doesn't have smooth muscle in its wall. So it's really a space. Draining into that space from the subarachnoid through arachnoid granulations, we have the CSF. So we have at the top of the brain this split in the dura mater. So that would be this channel that I'm illustrating right here. And from the pia mater, we have the pia mater on the surface of the brain. And we have the arachnoid mater with its connective tissue fibers. And then there are gaps in the inferior aspect of these where we have arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi. Across that gap, across that membrane, we have CSF entering into the sinuses. Okay? And the CSF is produced by the ventricle, the choroplexus of the ventricles, and it leaves the fourth ventricle from the foramen. These are known as, I'm not going to be testing you on this part, but just to bring you up to speed, arachnoid granulations, or villi. And then the venous blood, that's CSF, which came from the blood, if you recall. So it's formed across the capillary wall and comes from the venous system. So we have venules and capillaries and forming venules coming to the surface of the brain and forming our surface veins, matching. We have a middle cerebral vein and a posterior cerebral vein and so on. And these veins also empty into the sinuses. So the structures that are shown in blue in the meninges, their spaces in the dura mater are these sinuses. And so because our choroplexus fluid, our cerebrospinal fluid, comes from the capillaries, it has to return to the capillaries because it's ongoing, it's being continually secreted. So we have to return that fluid back to the cardiovascular system to maintain that balance of fluid. And then our blood is coming into the brain going through capillaries and forming the veins, and that has to be returned to the cardiovascular system. So all of that is collected into sinuses. And they are known as dural sinuses because they're found in the dura mater. And so we have this pattern where they follow the shape of the dura mater. And I'll diagram that on the board for you. But we have these models that show the blue structures are the sinuses. We also have this model that you can look at for the cerebral circuit that I drew for you on Thursday, and a harder model of the dural sinuses. Okay? So what are the veins? We have vertebral veins that we kind of ignore, but the vertebral veins are there that travel with the vertebral arteries. What do we call, we don't have carotid veins. So what do we call the veins that are carrying this combined CSF and blood away from the brain?
Jugular.
The jugular. Okay. And remember an opening by that name? The jugular foramen. All right, so that's where all of this is coming to. So internal carotids came in through the carotid canal, vertebrals through the foramen magnum. Vertebral veins will exit the same way through the foramen magnum, but our venous blood is exiting via the foramen, the jugular foramen, because that's where the internal jugular veins start, is at the jugular foramen. So let's, if you want this diagram, it's in your textbook. So, all right, so the largest of our sinuses is at the top portion, and it follows the top of the falx cerebri right over the longitudinal fissure. So it has this S shape to it. And this is identified as the superior sagittal sinus. It was a cross-section of that I just drew on the board for you. Okay. Then following the curvature of the corpus callosum, that would be this one up here. Following these little blue things are the cerebral veins draining into it. Following the curvature of the corpus callosum and the inferior border of the falx cerebri, we have the inferior sagittal sinus. It's not quite as well defined. So blood that is in the inferior sagittal sinus joins blood that is being, or CSF combined fluid, that is being drained from the superior sagittal sinus and travels down the midline of the tentorium cerebelli. Over here. And that's known as the straight sinus. Once it's there, it joins with the fluid in the superior sagittal sinus at a region called the confluence. I don't hold you responsible for that. And then it travels horizontally, laterally, in the edge of the tentorium cerebelli. So that would be right along here. Okay? So here's inferior sagittal sinus, here's superior sagittal sinus, and then it can go either to the right or to the left along the transverse sinus. In our real skulls, you can actually see a depression, a groove, created when the bony matrix was still osteoid and soft before it ossified. And in this skull, you can see where that, what I just showed you, is still attached to the surface of the skull. Okay? So it's heading to the right and to the left. So these are transverse sinuses. And then the jugular foramen is medial. It's just about 2 centimeters above the foramen magnum. So our blood flow has to pass medially as it goes along the lateral edge here. So it makes a couple of curves, which are sigmoid shaped. So these are sigmoid sinuses. and they reach the jugular foramen. Now there are additional sinuses that are anterior. There's a huge cavernous sinus on either side of the sella turcica, the base of the sella turcica. There's obviously venous drainage from the frontal part of the brain, but we're not going to worry about those. I just don't want you to think that they don't exist. So there are other smaller sinuses that we're not going to worry about. Okay. These are the ones that you need to know. This is the cavernous sinus I just mentioned. And here's the jugular foramen. And then that's the origin. Once we have a vessel at that point, that is now called the internal jugular vein. It's a bit larger, quite a bit larger than the external jugular vein. So if we were to sequence the blood flow, we start at the superior sagittal sinus. You would have superior, I'm just writing in words what you can see on the board as an image. Superior sagittal sinus, the transverse sinus, the sigmoid sinus. So internal jugular vein. If we start with the inferior sagittal sinus, then we have to enter the straight sinus. And then we can go into the transverse sinus. Looking at these three-dimensional objects makes it a lot easier to visualize that sequence than looking at the diagram. But in this diagram, again, from the right side of the head and neck, you can see the sinus is shown as this pale blue. All right, so here would be the sigmoid sinus, jugular foramen, and now we have the internal jugular vein. So if you need pictures, go ahead, because I'm going to erase that image and start at this level right here. Although I didn't diagram them on there, we would have veins accompanying the arteries we just talked about. There would be anterior cerebral veins and middle cerebral veins and posterior cerebral veins traveling with those vessels, plus a whole lot more that aren't named that we find on the surface of the skull. So actually, I'm going to move this over a little bit so not so far to the So internal jugular vein is quite large when we compare it to the external jugular vein. Now, remember when I drew internal and external carotids, our external carotid was more medial. That's because it was moving towards the face, all right? Internal jugular here is going to join with our subclavian to form our brachiocephalic vein, and the external jugular is found just under the skin. One of the best landmarks to look for it is sternocleidomastoid. Okay? So it kind of follows along in that direction. It's shown going straight up and down here, but it kind of follows along, at least in the lower portion, the direction of the fibers of the sternocleidomastoid. So if you see it external, you see it on the surface of the sternocleidomastoid, it's going to be the external jugular, not the internal jugular. Okay? The internal jugular is a couple times larger, at least. So we have internal jugular. And that is going to join, colors are not coming off very clearly. That is going to join with the subclavian. Start this up first. To form a brachiocephalic vein. Then we have the external jugular. An external jugular is receiving many of the same vessels that were formed by the external carotid, with one major exception, and that is the facial. Facial can go either direction, so let me draw in the external jugular here for just a second. And here's facial. Facial primarily goes into internal jugular, but it can go up to and join into the external jugular. Depends on pressure, because remember, pressure is what drives our blood flow. So facial is going to drain primarily into internal jugular. Here is our external jugular. And then the vessel that joins the two, that occurs right along here. So the name of this vessel is the retromandibular vein. Retro meaning behind. Actually, it would make more sense if the maxillary artery was called the retromandibular artery, but has more to do with that area. Okay. So facial drains primarily into internal, and then the external carotid is made up primarily of the I don't have it on here, so I'm just going to name it. The superficial temporal, and the occipital vein, which is coming from the back of the skull. So we have occipital vein here, superficial veins here, superficial temporal veins. All the other veins that we talked about, I'm not going to put them on there because they fly and they're the same. And then this retromandibular vein connecting those. Thyroid veins, rather than draining into the internal jugular or external jugular, are going to drain into these brachiocephalics. Between internal jugular and external jugular is where we see the vertebral vein coming in. So kind of from the back. that's the vertebral vein. So if we look on our model, here would be the superficial temporal arteries, superficial temporal veins found with them. Okay. Facial arteries, facial vein found with it. Difference is it uses the retromandibular vein to get into the internal jugular. Back here would be our occipital vein, and it continues on as the external jugular vein.
What is facial?
Oh, thank you. It's 5 vertebral?
Yes.
Yep.
I should just have you guys read off these numbers for me. All right, also on this model, by the way, if you look medially, you can see the, oh yeah, you tell me, what artery is this? Goes medially over the corpus callosum,
That's the anterior?
anterior
Cerebral?
cerebral. Okay, and then above it here, we have the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, so you can see some structures here. All right, so one of the things about the facial vein, aside from it, the fact that it runs into the internal carotid, is the fact, and I mentioned this in 430, I think, last semester, the valves between facial vein and inside the nasal cavity and through the inferior orbital fissure and superior of the eye, there are no valves. So this is known as the danger triangle. If you have pimples acting in that area, not the deep ones, well, those two, but the ones that look like they just want to be popped, you want to be really careful about that area because pressing on that to pop it can drive the bacteria and pus backwards towards the brain. Okay? It's a rare occurrence, but because the valves aren't there, they're not going to stop that backwards flow. And as you put pressure on your skin, trying to pop that pimple or zit or whatever, it can drive the infected material into your brain rather than popping it out through the skin. So that's why that area right there is known as a danger. Down here is fine. Okay? You just want to be careful about this area right here. Okay, so other than those few differences, other superficial vessels on the face are similar in travel with our arteries. And so now we're down at the base of the neck and the shoulder region. And we have similar names with one addition. Remember we had a brachiocephalic trunk in the arterial system that gave rise to subclavian and common carotid. So this looks very similar, except we have an internal jugular. There's no common jugular. Okay, that doesn't exist. We have a right brachiocephalic trunk and subclavian, but instead of the right brachiocephalic trunk being formed by common carotid, a lecture type question would be, which of the following vessels join together to form the brachiocephalic vein? And in that case, it would be the internal sheet with all the numbers.
Over there on the counter.
Way over there. Okay. So internal jugular and subclavian are going to join together to form the brachiocephalic vein. So 6 is brachiocephalic vein. And then we have the subclavian, which is 7. Now brachia, we are going to add a new vessel. Instead of the aorta above the heart, we have the superior vena cava. Okay? So this whole pattern that I just drew on the board is repeated on the left side. Here's our superior vena cava. And on the right side, on the left side, we're going to have a brachiocephalic vein. However, where is the right side of the heart? Is it over here, or is it in the midline? In the midline. So the right brachiocephalic vein is here. And if we look at, I'm looking for a pattern here. Let me go back to the previous one. So the right brachiocephalic vein is coming down almost straight, whereas the left has a little bit farther to travel from the left side to get over to the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is more in line with the right side. It's closer to the right side of the body since the heart is shifted to the left. So you're going to see a longer left subclavian vein. And then we would have left internal jugular, vertebral, external jugular. I did put right and left. Now notice, in the arterial system, we only had one brachiocephalic trunk. We have a matching, if you will, brachiocephalic vein, but we add brachiocephalic vein to the other side. So we have two brachiocephalic veins instead of just one. And then I'll just write superior vena cava in here for now. All right, we'll wait to do the chest wall for a bit, but I want to move this up, so if you want to take pictures, go ahead, because I want to move all of the head and neck stuff up to the, off the wall, so I can draw in our upper extremities. Then I'll do the chest area and give you lab time.
Does the maxillary vein come off of here somewhere?
Yeah, maxillary is going to drain into external carotid as well.
The middle one on the left side, that's the vertebral one?
Uh-huh.
Or vertebral
Yeah.
vein?
They're really closer together than that. It kind of comes into the back side of the subclavian rather than put into the top. So you have the two external jugular and external jugular and internal jugular. It's going to come in kind of at the back like that, kind of at an angle. All righty? We're going to have subclavian, external jugular, internal jugular, vertebral, internal jugular, forming brachiocephalic vein, and brachiocephalic vein, and superior vena cava. So another type question would be what two vessels join together to form superior vena cava and brachiocephalic vein. So now let's look at the vessels that drain the upper limb. We have our deep vessels. Remember, the arteries are deep because they're under high pressure, and that protects them. And Jeff said something Tuesday when we were doing the cadaver presentation that I hadn't really thought of, and that is at places where we have flexion occurring. Many of the times where we have flexion occurring, the artery and veins come close to the surface. And so we, at the wrist, in the cubital fossa, we don't come close to the surface in the back, that would just stretch them. The back of the knee, the femoral region, where we can palpate and take pulses. Okay? So those otherwise, other than that, they are deep, and that protects them. So the vessels that are drawn here in dark color, light color, are the deep vessels. they're gonna follow and drain in the opposite direction the arteries that we just discussed. So I'm gonna draw them first, and then we have 3.5 additional superficial veins that are just under the skin. This model is fine for arterial system, a little difficult to follow for the venous system.